Thanks for having me, Francis.
Firstly, why putting investors first? And I ask because a lot of companies have done a lot of dodgy things because they are worried about their investors and shareholders rather than anybody else.
And I think it's because investors are used here in a different context. So if we're thinking in terms of companies and the stakeholders that are involved there, and you look at the investors into that company, it's a very different focus for a company to focus on its shareholders, investors in that sense, versus what we're talking about here, which is really the financial services industry and anybody that puts their trust and their faith and, of course, their hard-earned money with the industry. And I think the key word here is that services component. As a financial industry, we need to go back to servicing the greater society rather than focus on the profit motive or the capital motive of the capital system. And interesting that, as you mentioned in your introduction, that the CFA Institute was really founded in the early 1930s after the previous great financial crisis. And what we're seeing today really is the result of some initiatives that were launched by the CFA Institute, but within the bigger industry after the global financial crisis of 2008 also, where I think what we really see is a crisis of confidence in the industry, where so many different surveys, not just in South Africa but internationally also, really talk to the lack of confidence that people have in their financial advisor, in their investment advisor, in their bank, just about anybody related to the financial services industry. And I think the initiative that we're talking about here is let us as an industry focus on where the attention really should be and say, who are we actually doing this for? Whose money is it that we're actually dealing with? And it is the investor and the end user.
It couldn't have helped those leaks from Goldman Sachs a few years ago, where investors, professionals, were reported to have called their clients stupid and, just using them to make money. Is that the perception that you're dealing with?
I think definitely, and I think a lot of that stems from this information asymmetry that we had in the industry. I quite like the analogy maybe to what it was like in the religious world prior to the Bible first being translated into German. Up until then, it was only available in Latin, so it was really the learned, the intellectuals, really the Pope and the people closely around him that was supposed to not only understand the Bible, but was able to tell everybody else, how does this work? And I think we had much the same in the financial industry as well. It's supposed to be this closed industry where only the select few actually know what this is all about. All of that is changing, where we really, just like the freedom that came with the empowerment of knowledge and education came through understanding the Bible in German, we now have a financial industry where education is a lot more prevalent, where transparency is so much more prevalent, and where by putting investors first, we are really encouraging every single person to actually go out and ask the difficult questions of their bank manager, of their financial advisor, of the trustees of their company pension fund, really just to say, I as an investor and as a financial services participant have actually got a right to ethical treatment, to honest and fair practices, to transparency in terms of costs and fees, in terms of confidentiality of my personal information, a range of these things. And to that end, we put out this little thing called a Statement of Investor Rights, which really it's quite American, it's sort of the American Bill of Human Rights, but it really talks to each individual's right to these things that we mention. It sounds so obvious, but the fact that we have to actually emphasize it and focus on it just shows you the extent to which the global financial industry has really deteriorated.
Well, I want to ask you what it's like, because you're an insider and you're a CFA. You're in the industry. You're talking about people being a lot more educated, but we still rely on a lot of information coming from professionals, and there's this chain of information that goes from one to the next, from the researchers to the stockbrokers, say.
Yes.
I saw a report recently that was heavily criticized for being too glowing about South Africa, and the claim was that the investment house wanted to sell this emerging market story because they're investing in emerging markets. Is that happening? Is information being twisted?
Yes, it does sometimes happen, and to various degrees. I'm not for a minute going to try and say that suddenly this industry is turning itself around and suddenly everything is 100% hunky-dory. I think that is exactly why we need initiatives like this. The beauty about the CFA Institute and the CFA Charter also, this is a volunteer organisation, and I almost want to relate the code of conduct that CFA Charter holders ascribe to, similar to the Hippocratic oath that a doctor would undertake. So within your investment industry and financial services industry, you would have CFA Charter holders who, by the mere fact that we do have the charter, means that we have to, on an annual basis, subscribe to a certain ethical code of conduct. And that is what's required of us. But we all do this in our personal capacity, individual capacity, which we then have to carry through to our day jobs, to our organizations, and be the ethical voice of reason.
Let me quickly ask you about that, because becoming a CFA is difficult. I know that you won, and I applaud you for doing that. But not everybody in finance is a CFA. There are very few of you.
Exactly.
So how are you going to try and influence everybody else? How do you build that confidence?
Well, in fact, there's only 120,000 CFA Charter holders worldwide, so that gives you an idea of the relative exclusivity of it. But I think one of the changes that CFA Institute worldwide instituted last year was really three initiatives. The one is to serve a broader community, so the society as a whole, to speak with a bolder voice and really to have a bigger mission. And that bigger mission is really to use finance to the greater good of society. So one of the initiatives there is also around a new investment certification called the Claritas Investment Certification, which really is focused on where the CFA, the gold standard is a 3-4 year process and exams. The Claritas certification really is focused on people that are working in related industries but are not the investment decision makers. So these could be people maybe in legal, in IT, in finance, in journalism, in HR, people who need to understand more about the terminology that is being used but are not expected to make the investment decisions. And I think this is just one example of the extent to which this opening up of the education is really talking to individuals and to people across a much broader industry. And with more awareness and knowledge and education, I think it can only serve us all in good stead to really steady the ship and bring back the confidence into the financial industry.
A great initiative, it sounds like. Thank you for joining us. That was Nerina Visser from Nedbank Capital and the CFA Institute. Let's take a quick look at the numbers. The JSE closed high today. 50,000 points is now in sight. The All Share Index